Our scripture today comes from the Gospel of Luke, chapter 23. As they led him away, they seized a man, Simon of Cyrene, who was coming from the country, and they laid the cross on him and made him carry it behind Jesus. A great number of the people followed him, and among them were women who were beating their breasts and wailing for him. But Jesus turned to them and said, "Daughters of Jerusalem, do not weep for me, but weep for yourselves and for your children." It was now about noon, and darkness came over the whole land until 3 p.m, while the sun's light failed and the curtain of the temple was torn in two. Then Jesus cried with a loud voice, said, "Father, into your hands I commend my spirit." Having said this, he breathed his last. When the centurion saw what had taken place, he praised God and said, "Certainly this man was innocent." And when all the crowds who had gathered there for this spectacle saw what had taken place, they returned home, beating their breasts. But all his acquaintances, including the women who had followed him from Galilee, stood at a distance watching these things. So we began our service with the triumphal entry, the big entrance that Jesus made into Jerusalem that is found in each of the four Gospels. And I was thinking to myself as I was reflecting on that particular part of the story of how that same event would be covered if it happened today with today's news media. Because it definitely would be a media event. And when I think about Jesus coming into Jerusalem and this big fanfare, I could not help but be reminded of all the times in the past few months that we have seen a political candidate come into a political rally and how the people are going crazy. And it's very similar. I mean, when Jesus came into Jerusalem, there were people waving palm branches and shouting, "Hosanna, blessed is the one who comes in the name of the Lord." And in our political rallies, and the candidate comes in, people are shouting, they're waving their banners. Sometimes they're chanting the name of the candidate. I don't know if that happened in Jerusalem. Maybe there was a crowd going, "Jesus, Jesus, Jesus." I don't know. But I got to thinking, how would that look if it was covered by today's media? First of all, there would be lots of analysts, because there's always analysts whenever there's a political event, and some of those analysts would start talking about how Jesus is riding a wave of momentum, how he could possibly sweep the Jerusalem caucus, take all the delegates in Jerusalem. And they would start talking about his base, where most of his support comes from, and they would start giving us the demographics of Jesus' supporters. And so what we would hear is that Jesus is supported primarily by the underclasses, by the poorest of the poor. We would hear that he had also some supporters among the very rich, but the very rich that supported him were kind of tainted with scandal because they would have been tax collectors. And these are people who made their wealth on robbing the people. And so most of his support coming from the very poor, the occasional very rich tax collector, but then also from the lepers that were untouchable, that Jesus frequently touched as he healed them. And we would hear that he had some support among shepherds, which was a class of people that had no status and were not even allowed to testify in court. And I'm sure we would hear that he had support among the prostitutes and those that were looked down upon and shamed by the culture. And they would probably point out that it was very interesting that he also seemed to enjoy a lot of support among fishermen for some strange reason. And that would be his base. And I'm sure that his base was there the day that he rode into Jerusalem with this big entrance. But I'm sure that in addition to his base, there were probably also kind of hangers-on or bandwagoners. These are the people who like to show up at any event where they think it's about a winner, and they want to be on the winning side. And so there's always lots of bandwagoners at political events, and there probably were some folks on the bandwagon when they saw Jesus coming in to Jerusalem. I know about being a bandwagon fan because I'm a bandwagon fan myself. I grew up in the South, and during the 70s with my childhood, the Atlanta Braves were always in the very last place of their division. And TBS insisted on showing every one of their games on TV throughout the baseball season. So 162 games were broadcast on television of a losing team. And it always upset me because when the Braves were on, some of my favorite shows were not. And I hated the Braves until the mid-'80s to the mid-'90s when they started winning. And they had that great pitching staff, and they went to the postseason year after year after year, and suddenly I was a Braves fan. And when we lived in Atlanta, we went to like 17 games, and we did the chop, and I was totally there with the Braves. And then they started going back downhill again, and they've been downhill now for several seasons, and I haven't watched a Braves game in 10 years. My brother is hardcore. He's committed. He's dedicated. He watches the Braves. He's excited about this new season, which, let's face it, they don't have a chance, but he's excited about this new season. And he will watch all 162 games. He will TiVo them, he's not there, but he will watch them all. And I will not pay attention unless they're in first or second place, getting close to the playoffs. And then I will become a Braves fan once again. So I get about being on the bandwagon, and I imagine there were lots of people on the bandwagon when Jesus rode into town. Now, of course, if it was covered in today's media, there would also be those pointing out negativity. There'd be negative ads and smear campaigns against Jesus, just as there were in biblical times, but today, of course, they would get much more exposure. Even in Jesus' time, there was negative ads. He was accused of being a drunkard and a glutton. People would say, I seem to recall, do you remember something that happened at a wedding once in Cana where they ran out of wine and suddenly Jesus shows up and there's wine for everybody? He's a drunkard. And do you remember that time that there were those people gathered and they didn't have enough food? And Jesus shows up and there's food for everybody? I mean, it seems like every meal with Jesus is all you can eat and all you can drink. So he's definitely a glutton and a drunkard. And the negative ads would continue, and they would talk about how, Jesus has frequently been seen in the company of prostitutes. He seems to go to restaurants and hang out in places where those kinds of people are. You know that, guilt by association. And so there would be a lot of smear tactics aimed at Jesus, if covered by today's media. And in fact, it happened in his own time. In fact, it was successful because less than a week from the time that Jesus rode into town with the triumphant crowd shouting Hosanna, he was hanging on a cross in shame and scandal. The movement defeated. The negative ads worked. And the people, the bandwagoners who were shouting Hosanna when he rode into town were shouting Crucify when he was on the cross. Now, as I thought about all that stuff, the question came to me in the middle of the night, which was, if Jesus were here today, and if Jesus were running for President of the United States, would he stand a chance? And as I thought about it, and realized we've kind of been talking about Gandhi a lot the last few weeks, I thought that if Jesus were running for office, he would probably use a strategy employed by Gandhi. Gandhi called it Satyagraha, and it literally means soul force or true force. And embedded within that were some principles that Gandhi tried to live by. And one of them was that he would not respond to an attack with an attack. He would not respond to violence with violence. Now, I say that Jesus could be following Gandhi's philosophy, but the truth is that Gandhi was actually following Jesus' much older philosophy. Do you remember the time when Jesus said, love those who hate you? If you love those who love you, what's so special about that? Everybody does that. you're going to be my follower, love those who hate you. Love your enemy. Turn the other cheek. Do you remember Jesus saying those things? And in fact, in the last week of his life, when Jesus was arrested in the garden, and one or two of his followers drew their swords and wanted to fight back, wanted to respond to violence with violence, and Jesus said, no, put the swords away. We're not going to do that. And then at his trial, when he was accused, sometimes falsely accused, he said nothing in his own defense. And then at his execution on the cross, as he was derided by the crowd, mocked by the religious leaders, he did not respond in kind. In fact, we're told in one gospel that he prayed to God to forgive them. Here I want to take a time out from the sermon, and I want to say a word about Jesus. Sometimes we do Jesus and ourselves a disservice by lifting Jesus so high up, making him so high and holy, that he can no longer serve as a role model for us. In fact, that's kind of what happened when Jesus rode into town in Jerusalem. The people lifted him up so high. He was going to be the Savior, the Messiah who would deliver them from Rome. He was going to be wonderful and perfect and exactly what they wanted. And Jesus could not live up to those expectations, and so they turned on him. Now, sometimes I can hear people saying, because we do the same thing, I can hear people saying, well, Jesus didn't respond to the accusations, and he didn't fight back because Jesus knew that he needed to die for the sins of the world. And here is where we need to really take that time out and realize that the idea that Jesus died for the sins of the world came much later. That's Christians later, after the fact, thinking about this. Why did Jesus die? It makes no sense. And they came up with this explanation. But in the moment that it was happening, Jesus was just like you and me, surrounded by the same threats and accusations and fear. And in that moment, he had to decide what kind of person he was going to be. And we rob him of that character, and we rob him of that courage when we treat him as though, well, he's just the divine son here to do what God sent him to do. No, he was a human being faced with the same fears and challenges that we're faced with, and he decided to respond in grace and wisdom and love. End of the timeout. The other part of Satyagraha that Jesus would apply is that I don't think Jesus would separate the means from the ends. You've probably heard the phrase, the ends justify the means. You ever heard that? As if to say that our goal is so worthy and so honorable that any means necessary to make it happen. And if there was one thing I could say characterizes our political climate in this country, it's that both sides believe that their end is so noble that they'll do whatever it takes to achieve it. I don't think Jesus would do that because I think Jesus, like Gandhi, believed that the means, the strategies that you use to win are embedded in the victory you achieve. So that if you use lies and threats and fear-mongering to win an election, that the victory you have will be characterized by lies and threats and fear-mongering. That they're all of the same piece. And you can't separate the means from the ends. It would be as though thinking of it as kind of preparing a dish. If the ingredients are fear and hate, and that shows up in your recipe for campaigning, then the bread that you serve when you win the election is going to be a bread that is filled with that same fear and that same hate. In our current political climate, with our 24 hours news obsession, with our culture addicted to big spectacles, do you think it's possible for a candidate who comes along and is honestly vulnerable. Not telling it like it is. That's easy. Anybody can do that. But telling it like I am. And being candid about doubt. And a candidate who would stand up for Jesus' demographic. The least of these, the left out. A candidate that would not participate in smear tactics. A candidate that did not operate on fear and self-promotion. Do you think it's possible for that kind of candidate to ever get elected president of the United States? I got to tell you, I don't. I don't think it's possible. Which means that I don't think it's possible that Jesus would win the election. In fact, I'm not even sure Jesus would get the nomination from a party. This picture is called View from the Cross. It was painted by James Tissot around 1890. He was a French artist. And I like it because it's different from most crucifixion paintings. Most of the time when you see a depiction of the crucifixion, what you see is Jesus on the cross, front and center. I like this one because this is actually a painting of Jesus' view from the cross looking down at the people. And you can just barely see Jesus' feet, the front tips of his toes right here in the very bottom of the screen. And you look at that painting and you see this woman here at the foot of the cross, these three women, and what looks to be like a male disciple. So these are all kind of close disciples, maybe his mother, Mary Magdalene, who knows. This is a depiction from John's version. In Matthew, Mark, and Luke, Jesus is utterly alone. There are no followers close by. But in John's version, he does have some followers close, and he looks down upon them. Imagine that he sees them in their anguish and their grief. And don't you imagine that he just feels great compassion for them? Great empathy with what they're going through. And then over here, on the left-hand side of here, we see a Roman guard, perhaps the centurion who, according to Luke, said that when Jesus died, surely this was an innocent man. And I see Jesus, this is looking through Jesus' eyes, and I can imagine Jesus seeing that centurion and seeing people everywhere who are trapped. People who are idealists, who've had to compromise their ideals because of the pragmatic life. And here's a person doing a job, doing what he's told to, maybe supporting a family, who really thinks Jesus is innocent, but can't say anything, can't do anything, just doing his job. All these people that are trapped like this. I can see Jesus looking at people like the centurion with that same compassion and empathy, grieving for them, with them, even as he hangs on the cross. And over here on horseback, apparently, are the religious leaders and the scribes, the opponents that Jesus faced through most of history. Supposedly very happy that Jesus is now being crucified, who handed him over to the Romans. And I can just, using this painting, I can just imagine looking at them through the eyes of Jesus, and Jesus recognizing in them people everywhere who are so insecure that they have to be trapped in this cocoon of certainty and confidence and can never let their guard down and never show vulnerability because they've always got to be winners and they've always got to be certain. And they're so misguided. And they're so alienated from what makes us human that Jesus looks at the very people who helped orchestrate his death, and I imagine he has the same empathy and compassion for them that he does all the other groups that he sees. And then there are just all these other people out there. Bystanders, hangers-on, maybe some of them part of the bandwagon crowd that greeted him when he came to town. Now they're here watching the crucifixion. And I imagine that some of them are as cavalier about this. They're like us, and we stop and we see something, and they're watching, and then after a while they say, hey, let's go get something to eat, and they walk away. They're indifferent, and I imagine Jesus looks at them with the same compassion and thinks, I feel for all those who cannot make a commitment, who are standers by, who cannot engage because they are afraid. And I can just imagine Jesus having these feelings as he looked down on those who were there at the cross. The social sin for today, in our sermon series, Gandhi's 7 Deadly Social Sins, is politics without principle. I take that to mean ends without means. Believing that you can do anything to justify your noble goal. I think that Jesus lived a certain kind of life characterized by humility and brokenness and service, and that the life he lived, the means by which he lived his life, ultimately led to his end. The death that he died also full of that same brokenness and humility and compassion and love, and that's the recipe that he made so that we, centuries later, can feast on the bread of resurrection that gives us a chance to have peace. It's not a peace of the rally. We're going to win. It's the peace of the crucifixion that says it's okay to be broken. As you look at this picture, try to imagine where you might be in this painting. Or perhaps a better question is, should any of us be in this painting at all? Because Jesus called us to take up our own cross and to die with him. Now, in today's world, I don't expect any of us to literally get crucified. But imagine yourself looking out at our nation, at America, and put yourself in Jesus' view. What would happen to you if you stood up for the same people Jesus stood up for? What would happen to you if you touched the untouchable, loved the unlovable? How would our nation react to you if you promoted brokenness and vulnerability instead of victory and strength? How does this nation look to people like Jesus? Why do we keep crucifying love over and over and over again? I close with this quote from writer Anais Nin. And when I came across it, I thought that is the crucifixion. Love never dies of a natural death. It dies because we don't know how to replenish its source. It dies of blindness and errors and betrayals. It dies of illness and wounds. It dies of weariness, of witherings, of tarnishings, but never of natural death.